Good morning. It's Thursday, and I'm going to be reading starting at chapter 20 in the book, The Island of the Blue Dolphins. It's on page 125 in my book. Not sure what page it is in yours because we have 3 different editions out there. So look for chapter 20. That's where I'm going to start reading today. And I'm going to read chapters 20 and 21 with you. So you can follow along beginning on chapter 20. I gathered 2 more canoe loads of abalone soon after that, mostly the sweet red ones, which I cleaned and carried to the house. Along the south part of the fence where the sun shone most of the day, I built long shelves out of branches and put the meat up to dry. Abalones are larger than your hand and twice as thick when fresh, but they shrink small in the sun, so you have to dry many. In the old days on the island, there were children to keep away the gulls, which would rather feast on abalones than anything else. In the morning, if the meat was left unguarded, they could fly off with a month's harvest. At first, whenever I went to the spring or to the beach, I left Ranchu behind to chase them off, but he did not like this and howled all the time I was gone. Finally, I tied strings to some of the abalone shells and hung them from poles. The insides of the shells are bright red and catch the sun, and they turn one way or another in the wind. And after that, I had little trouble with the gulls. I also caught small fish in a net that I had made and hung them up to dry for winter light. With meat drying on the shells and the shells fishing and flashing and turning in the wind and the strings of fish hanging on the fence, the yard looked as if a whole village were living there on the headland instead of just Ranchu and me. Every morning after I had gathered food for the winter, we went out on the sea. At the end of the summer, I would gather roots and seeds to store, but now there was nothing that needed to be done. We went many places those first days of summer, to the beach where the sea elephants lived, to the black cave, which was even larger than the first cave we found, and to the tall rock where the cormorants roosted. Tall Rock was more than a league from the island, and it was black and shimmering because it was covered with cormorants. I killed 10 of the birds the first time we went there, and I skinned and fleshed them and put them out to dry. For someday, I wanted to make myself a skirt of cormorant feathers. Black Cave was on the south coast of the island near the place where the canoes were stored. In front of the cave was a high ledge of rocks and surrounded by deep kelp beds, and I would have paddled by it had I not seen a sea hawk fly out. The sun was in the west, and I had a very long way to go to reach home, but I was curious about the hawk and the place he lived in. The opening of the cave was small, like the one in the cave under the headland, and Ranchu and I had to crouch low to get through. Weak light came from outside, and I saw that we were in a room with black shining walls that curved high overhead. At the far end of the room was another small opening. It was long and very dark. But when we reached the end of it, we were in another room, which was larger than the first and lit with a shaft of light. The light came from the sun, which shone down through a jagged crack in the ceiling. Seeing the sun shining down and the black shadows drifting over the walls, Ranchu barked and then began to howl. The sound echoed through the cave like the howling of a whole pack of dogs. It sent a cold feeling down my back. "Be quiet," I shouted, putting my hand over his jaws. My words echoed and echoed in the room. I turned the canoe around and started back toward the opening. Above it, on a deep ledge that ran from one side of the room to the other, my gaze fell upon a row of strange figures. There must have been 24 of them standing against the black wall. They were as tall as I, with arms and legs and short bodies made of reeds and clothed in gull feathers. Each one had eyes fashioned of round or oblong discs of abalone shell, but the rest of their faces were blank. The eyes glittered down at me and moved as the light on the water moved and reflected upon them. They were more alive than the eyes of those who live. In the middle of the group was a seated figure, a skeleton. It sat leaning against the wall with its knees drawn up and its fingers, which were raised to its mouth, a flute of pelican bone. There were other things that were on the ledge. In the shadows among the standing figures, but having drifted far back in the room, I again paddled toward the opening. I had forgotten that the tide was coming in, and to my great surprise, the opening had narrowed. It was too small for me to get through. We would have to stay there in the room until the tide went out, until dawn came. I paddled to the far end of the cave. I did not look back at the glittering eyes of the figures on the ledge. I crouched in the bottom of the canoe and watched the shaft of light grow weak. The opening out to the sea grew smaller and finally disappeared. Night came, and a star showed through the crevice overhead. This star passed out of sight, and another took its place. The tide lifted the canoe higher in the room, and the water lapped against the walls, and it sounded like the soft music of a flute. It played many tunes through the long night, and I slept little watching the stars change. I knew that the skeleton who sat on the ledge playing the flute was one of my ancestors, and the others with the glittering eyes, though only images, were too, but I was still sleepless and afraid. With the first light, another high tide almost setting, we left the cave. I did not look up at those standing quietly on the ledge or at the flute player playing for them, but paddled fast out into the morning sea, nor did I look back. I suppose this cave once had a name, I said to Raju, who was as glad to be free as I was, but I have never heard of it or heard it spoken about. We will call it Black Cave, and never in all our days will we go there again. When we came back to our voyage to Tall Rock, I hid the canoe in the cave below the headland. It was hard work, but each time I would lift the canoe from the water and onto the ledge, even though I planned to go out in the next morning. The 2 summers had come and gone, and the Aleut hunters had not returned. Yet during these days, I always looked for them. At dawn, as Rontu and I went down the cliff, I would watch the ocean for their sails. The summer air was clear, and I could see many leagues. Wherever we went in the canoe, I would never be gone longer than half a day. On the way home, I always paddled close to the shore and looked for them. It was the last time that we went to Tall Rock that the Aleuts came. I had hidden the canoe and climbed the cliff with the 10 cormorant skins slung over my back. At the top of the cliff, I stood for a while gazing at the sea. There were some small clouds on the water. One of them, the smallest, did not look like the others, and as I watched, I saw that it was a ship. The sun made bright scales on the water, but I could see clearly. There were 2 sails, and it was a ship coming toward the island. For a long time, I could not tell the color of the sails. I wondered if it would be the white men, though now I thought about them little and seldom looked for them. I left the cormorants hanging on the fence and went to the rock on the headland. I could see no better from the rock because the sun was low and the whole ocean was covered with light. And then as I stood there, I remembered that the white men's ship would come from the east, and this one came from a different location, from the north. I was still not sure that it belonged to the Aleuts, but I decided to pack the things that I would take to the cave in the ravine. There was much to take: my 2 birds, the skirt I had made, the stone utensils, my beads and earrings, the cormorant feathers, and all of my baskets and weapons. The abalones were not yet dry, so I would have to leave them. When I had packed everything and put it beside a hole under the fence, I went back to the headland. I lay on the rock so that I would not be seen and peered over its rim toward the north. For a moment, I did not find the ship, and then I saw that it had traveled faster than I thought it would. It was already rounding the kelp bed close to the rocks of Coral Cove. The last of the sun shone on the ship on the bow, which was made like the beak of a bird, and on the 2 red sails. I knew that the Aleuts would not come on shore in the dark, and that I had until morning to carry my things to the cave, but I did not wait. Most of the night I worked, making 2 trips to the cave. At dawn, when everything had been moved, I went back to the house for the last time. There, I buried the ashes of my fire and threw sand over the shells and the floor. I took down the shells I had put up to scare the gulls and tossed them and the abalones over a cliff. At last, with a pelican wing, I brushed away the marks of my feet, and when I had finished, it looked as if no one had lived there for a long time. By now the sun was up, and I climbed onto the rock. The ship lay at anchor in the cove. Canoes were bringing goods to the shore, and some were out in the kelp beds beginning to hunt for otter. There was a fire on the shore, and beside it a girl. She was cooking something, and I could see the fire shining on her hair. I did not stay long in the headland. Always in the past, I had gone to the ravine by a very different way and was not to wear a trail. This time, I went off toward the west along the cliff and then doubled back through the brush, being careful to leave no tracks. Rontu's prints did not matter because the Aleuts knew that there were dogs on the island. The cave was very dark, and I had trouble getting Rontu to go through the small opening. Only after I had crawled in and out several times would he follow me. I closed the opening with stones, and since I was tired, lay down and slept all that day. I slept until I could see the stars shining between the cracks in the rocks. This is chapter 21. I did not take Rontu with me when I left the cave that night, and I closed the opening so that he would not follow me, for if the Aleuts had brought their dogs, they would merely smell them out. I went quietly through the brush to the headland. Before I had climbed to the top of the high rock, I could see the glow of the Aleut fires. They had camped on the mesa at the place and the spring they had used before. It was less than half a league from my cave. I stood for a long time watching the fires and wondering if I should move to another part of the island, perhaps to the cave where the wild dogs had lived. I was not afraid that the men would discover me because they worked on the beach or hunted in their canoes all day. It was the girl I was afraid of. The ravine was tangled with brush, which was hard to walk through, but the ravine grew seeds and roots. Sometime when she was out looking for food, she might wander by the spring and see that it was being used and find my steps leading to the cave. I stood on the rock until the Aleut's fires died. I thought of everything I could do, of the different places I could go, and at last decided to stay in the ravine. The far end of the island had no springs, and if I moved there, I would have no place to hide the canoe, which I might need. When I went back to the cave, I did not leave until the moon was full. There was little food left. Rontu and I climbed to the headland. When we passed the house, I saw that 3 of the whale ribs had been cut from the fence. No one was there, or else Rontu would have barked. I waited until the tide was low, which was close to dawn, and filled a basket with seawater and abalones. We were back in the cave before it grew light. The seawater kept the abalones fresh, but when we had to go out again, the night was too dark to find our way to the reef. I therefore had to gather roots. I could never gather many before the sun rose, so I went out every morning until the next moon came, and then I went to the reef for abalones. During all this time, I saw none of the Aleuts, nor did the girl come near the cave, though I found her footsteps far down the ravine where she had been to dig roots. The Aleuts had not brought their dogs, which was fortunate, for they would have found Rontu's tracks and followed us to the cave. The days were long for Rontu and me. At first, he would pace up and down the cave and stand at the opening, sniffing through the cracks. I did not let him out except when I was with him, for fear he would go to the camp and not come back. After a while, he got used to this and would lie all day and watch whatever I was doing. It was dark in the cave, even when the sun was high, so I burned the small fish I had stored. By their light, I began to make a cormorant skirt, working every day on it. The 10 skins I had taken at Tall Rock were now dry and in condition to sew. All of them were from male cormorants whose feathers are thicker than those of the females and much glossier. The skirt of yucca fibers was simple to make. I wanted this one to be better, so I cut the skins carefully and sewed them with great care. I made the bottom first, putting the skins end to end and using 3 of them. For the rest of the skirt, I sewed the others along their sides so that the feathers ran one way on the upper part and a different way on the bottom. It was a beautiful skirt when I finished it on the day after the second moon. I had burned all of the little fish, and since I could catch no more until the Aleuts left, I took the skirt outside to work on it there. I had found footsteps in the ravine twice again for the first time, but no closer to the cave. I had begun to feel safe, for the winter storms would soon be here, and the Aleuts would leave. Before another moon, they would be gone. I had never seen the skirt in the sunlight. It was black, but underneath were green and gold colors, and all the feathers shimmered as though they were on fire. It was more beautiful than I thought it would be, and I worked fast now that it was almost finished, yet from time to time I would stop to hold it against my waist. Rontu, I said, feeling giddy with happiness, if you were not a male dog, I would make you one too, as beautiful as this. Rontu, who was sprawled out at the mouth of the cave, raised his head and yawned at me and went back to sleep. I was standing in the sunlight, holding the skirt to my waist, when Rontu leaped to his feet. I heard the sound of steps. It came from the direction of the spring, and as I turned quickly, I saw a girl looking down at me from the brush. My spear stood beside the mouth of the cave within easy reach. The girl was not more than 10 paces from me, and with one movement, I could have picked up the spear and thrown it. Why I did not throw the spear, I do not know, for she was one of the Aleuts who had killed my people on the beach of Coral Cove. She said something, and Rontu left the mouth of the cave and walked slowly toward her. The hair raised on his neck, but then he walked back to where she stood and let her touch him. The girl looked at me and made a motion with her hands, which I took to mean that Rontu was hers. No, I cried and shook my head. I picked up my spear. She started to turn, and I thought she was going to flee back through the brush. She made another motion, which I took to mean that Rontu was now mine. I did not believe her. I held the spear over my shoulder, ready to throw. Tutuk, she said, pointing to herself. I did not say my name. I called Rantu and came back. The girl looked at him and then at me and smiled. She was older than I, but not so tall. She had a broad face and small eyes that were very black. And when she smiled, I saw that her teeth were worn down from chewing seal sinew, but they were very white. I was still holding the cormorant skirt, and the girl pointed to it and said something. There was one word, Winsha, which sounded like a word that means pretty in our language. I was so proud of the skirt that I did not think. The spear was in my hand, but I held up the skirt so the sunlight would shine on all of it. The girl jumped down from the ledge and came over to me and touched it. Winsha, she said again. I did not say the word, but she wanted to hold the skirt, and I gave it to her. She put it against her waist and let it fall from her hips, turning one way and then the other. She was graceful, and the skirt flowed around her like water. But I hated the aloots, and I took it from her. Winsha, she said. I had not heard words spoken for so long that they sounded strange to me, yet they were good to hear, and even though it was an enemy who spoke them. She said other words I did not understand, but now as she spoke, she looked over my shoulder toward the cave. She pointed to the cave and then to me and made gestures as if she were making a fire. I knew that she wanted what she wanted me to say, but I did not say it. She wished to know if I lived there in the cave so that she could come back with the men and take me to their camp. I shook my head and pointed to the far end of the island, away, away, for I did not trust her. She kept looking toward the cave, but the girl said nothing more about it. I held the spear, which I could have thrown. I did not, though I feared she would return with the hunters. She came over to me and touched my arm. I did not like the feel of her hand. She said more words and smiled again and walked to the spring and drank. The next moment she disappeared in the brush. Rontu did not try to follow her. She made no noise as she went. I crawled back in the cave and began to pack the things I owned. I had all day to do it because the men were working and would not return to their camp before night. By nightfall, I was ready to go. I planned to take my canoe and go to the west part of the island. I could sleep there on the rocks until the aloots left, moving from place to place if I needed to. I carried 5 baskets up the ravine and hid them near my house. It was getting dark, and I had to go back to the cave for the 2 that were left. Carefully, I crawled through the brush and stopped just above the mouth of the cave and listened. Rontu was beside me, and he listened also. No one could go through the brush in the dusk without making a sound, except someone who had lived in it for a long time. I went past the spring and waited, and then on to the cave. I felt that someone had been there while I had been away. They could be hiding in the dark, watching me. They were waiting until I went into the cave. I was afraid, so I did not go in, but quickly turned around. As I did so, I saw something in front of the cave on a flat rock I used for a step. It was a necklace of black stones of a kind that I had never seen. And that's the end of chapter 21. Tomorrow we will continue with chapter 22. I hope you're enjoying the book. I'll be back tomorrow. Have a great day.